It's my great pleasure to welcome Rob McLean. Today, probably none of you know that I'm Canadian. I don't.
Oh no!
I don't think this has come up before.
Ever.
Ever. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah. But it is a rock kid. You got back. Yeah. Anyway, so it is a great pleasure to welcome a fellow Canadian. Rob is joining us today from I always get the I wrong, but the International Development Research Center, IDRC in Ottawa, that I think we all know very well. And Rob's also a faculty member at Ottawa University, and he's part of the Integrated Knowledge Translation Research Network program that's based at Ottawa General Hospital. He won't tell you, and because he's kind of a humble guy, but Rob was also a member of the Carleton Ravens national basketball champions a number of times, even with his shockingly short stature, and was on the Canadian Olympic kind of track. And just remember that Canada only lost by a few points to the US. So don't think that it's inferior basketball. It's not. I've never met Rob before, but I reached out to him after reading a really terrific paper of his in Nature a few years ago. And he's going to talk today about some work that follows on from that. So Rob, great pleasure to have you here, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. I did bring some.
Oh, that was you. I thought it was Jim.
Yes.
Terribly embarrassed to bring this sugar to school with such a great reputation in nutrition studies, but please pass them around and enjoy. Maple syrup. Sugar is amazing.
I'm
getting old. They're good. I see the whole box. I know them.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about something I'm passionate about, which is the evaluation of research quality. I'm going to introduce a framework called Research Quality Plus, or RQ Plus, and explain a little bit about how we've been using it, why we developed it, and what we want to do with it next. But to begin, I'm going to speak a little bit about myself, just introduce who I am, maybe a statement of positionality, and where all of this work came from. And a large part of the argument I'm going to make in the talk today is really that this framework can help contribute to sustainable development. And as is embedded in the Sustainable Development Goals, that is a global process. That's something that's happening everywhere. It's not something we're doing in the global north to support development in the global south. So I think Atlanta is a big part of that program. But a bit about me first. I think I should start with my education. I'm from Ottawa, Canada, where I went to school for basketball at Carleton University. I quickly learned that I liked school. I fell in love with school, and I fell in love with health research. And I went to KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where I studied and completed a second undergraduate degree. I then went to beautiful Manchester, England, a wonderful place to visit. If you ever have the chance, I'm not joking. It's stunning, and one of your colleagues is from there. I then went back to start my PhD studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. However, during those studies, I met Jimmy Volnick, who became my mentor for my PhD process, who is the Dean of Medicine at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So I finished my comp exams, moved to South Africa, started over under Jimmy's tutelage, and wasted a great deal of time, but learned a lot. He's the founder of Cochrane Africa, and has done a lot in the global health space. You may know him or of him. I then went back to the University of Ottawa, where I did my postdoctoral training in knowledge co-production at the Ottawa Hospital. But concurrent to all of these studies, I've been working, and I've kind of taken a non-traditional trajectory to my career, where I've worked adjacent to academia. And my first job in that space was at Canadian Institutes of Health Research. That's our NIH equivalent in Canada. And there I designed and became increasingly interested as we did this work in a large-scale evaluation of knowledge translation program. Knowledge translation is kind of a Canadian term. Maybe is it familiar to you guys? The notion of turning, that's the word we use for research use, in a sense. And we published this report. I think it was actually quite informative for how funding agencies globally are thinking about knowledge translation. And this is where a light bulb kind of went off for me about that important second half of research, not just our designs and our methods, but how it gets used and what it means to the world. And I went on to take a position at the International Development Research Center, which is a Canadian organization. I'm very proud as a Canadian that this organization exists. We fund research for development, largely in and always for the Global South. And so research for development is an important term. It's not the study of development. It's research that contributes to development processes. So really applied research, implementation research, this kind of thing, can be on a variety of topics. I work in the Global Health Group. And currently I run a research program that is a global multi-site project in climate and health. So we're working with institutions that have a regional presence across the Global South in each of the regions of West and Central Africa, East and Southern Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, Middle East and North Africa, and Asia, to track kind of emerging knowledge in the area of climate and health. And I think this is a very exciting investment that we're making. And it's an emerging field. We're learning a great deal around the intersections of climate change and how it's affecting human physical health, mental health, and social systems. But as I've been doing that work, I've become increasingly interested in the way that research is being used and how those innovations that we're coming across in our research work are being put into practice and impacting the real world. This is an image that was, I've used, Robin Hammond took it, and it's kind of showing the difficult decision in terms of agricultural solutions, how we position them in the world and the impact they actually have in people's lives. And I've done a lot of work on this topic of scaling, and I brought some books that we published recently in Routledge. So if you're interested in the notion, please take a look. Good news, it's also free online. You're interested, you don't have to take the hard copy, but I hope people do.
One, just.
Yeah, totally. Here. I think it's an important contribution to this emerging field that I'm calling scaling science. And the highest level premise here is that implementation science is about the use of knowledge, how knowledge gets put into use. Scaling science is about the impact of knowledge. So that use is happening at what scale? For whom? How equitable is that distribution? How sustainable is that distribution? How is that scale achieved across over time, not just space? And really thinking about the ways that knowledge impacts the world. This has gained a lot of attention. I've been really excited. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are investing in this and actually putting it into action in their programming, this approach, scaling science, thinking further beyond just use of knowledge. We've been invited to create an online course by Jeffrey Sachs at the SDG Academy, which is the UN agency that develops knowledge for hoping to achieve the SDGs. But that's not the topic I'm going to talk about today. But it's kind of giving a bit of background on where I come from, what my interests are, and what I hope to do in my career in research. And I kind of think about that career, it's been ever changing, and it's kind of that notion of a river, and we're flowing through it, and we make adjustments to the context that we're in. And so this is the Ottawa River, where I'm from, about 1885. And little known fact about Ottawa, Canada, is it was at one time the murder capital of North America, and also home to some of the biggest, the richest people on earth. The lumber industry was rooted through the rivers that connect in Ottawa. And there was a gentleman by the name of James Booth, who was considered as rich as Bill Gates was today, shipping these trees out to Europe to build the masts on tall ships. So this is a bit about the context where I'm from, and maybe if we pay attention to context, we can learn a few things. So let's zoom in on this scene. And this guy says, "Bonjour, which is the traditional French-Canadian greeting. Hello. And his friend on the side says, hi, A, the traditional Canadian English greeting.
Okay.
And he's wondering what's going on in his river journey. Where am I? He says, you are exactly 6 meters from shore, floating on a 300-kilogram log of mighty Canadian maple. Says, you must be a researcher. I am a researcher. How did you know? Because what you told me is absolutely true, but completely useless. And he says, you know, he's a researcher, he's a smart guy. He says, you must be a policymaker. And he says, oh my goodness, I am a policymaker. How did you know that? He says, well, you don't know where you are. You don't know where you're going. And now you're blaming me. So it's funny, but it's also an unsatisfactory outcome that often happens in research. You create research that's great, it's valid, it's rigorous, but it has no meaning or no value to users. And so kind of been an inspiration for a lot of what I'm doing and what I want to speak to you about today. I think one possible contribution to solving this is thinking differently about the way we value research, how we evaluate it. So I'm going to introduce this framework, Research Quality Plus, or RQ Plus. And the full thing is available in this, this paper we've written. And the title is important, Evaluating Research Differently. And so different from what, I think is the first question. And I want to introduce here kind of why we think there were issues with mainstream or traditional methods of research evaluation. So where does that begin? Well, typically it begins with a process called peer review. And as scientists, this happens across the course of your work. So you're reviewed for funding. You're reviewed to whether or not your work is ethical, whether or not it can be taken place. It's basically a review process. You're reviewed to get into a conference to talk about your work. You're reviewed to publish your work, so on and so forth. But increasingly, we've learned that there are systematic problems with the peer review process. The NIH has been unable to remove racial bias from who gets funded in its work. Sex and gender bias is existent across peer review processes, so not just funding, but actually publishing. It's been proven. Promotion and advance in your career. The bottom one here is a bit more of a thorny example, but it's almost a joke. A mathematician, a philosopher, and a I forget the other one's background, but they effectively wrote a series of phony papers. They used phony data set and phony frameworks, and they submitted them 20 papers to a set of journals. They actually had 7 published, and 3 were kicked around still in review when they came out publicly with it. And what they were trying to point out is that the system is flawed. They had basically published fake research with the review of their peers. A lot of people pushed back and said, this is outrageous, like you're undermining the whole thing by doing this. So a lot of debate around how that went down. I think the thing that's been most problematic for me in my work at research funding agencies has been this finding. And I had the great privilege to have a relationship with Richard Nakamura, who was the director of review at the NIH. And they published this work, which I give them a lot of credit for being this transparent at the NIH with their review work. But they basically have been unable to establish a relationship between review scores that you get on grant applications and the impact of the work. And when they mean impact, they don't mean like changing in people's lives or environmental sustainability or economic gain. They mean, did you get more publications? Did you get more students trained on your grant? They can't establish a relationship between scores and these things consistent. And so what happens to all these peer reviews? They basically get counted up in arithmetic models into what are called scientific metrics, so bibliometrics, altmetrics, different measures that attempt to quantify your peer reviews. So how many times you've been published, how many people have cited your published paper. And these are put on you as a researcher, they're put on institutions. A lot of how these university rankings happen are through these methods. But lately there's been major pushback against this kind of quantification and attempt to kind of minimize our value as researchers into single numeric values. This is a very important and famous piece that's published in Nature, really pushing back and giving principles for how we could do research measurement better or differently. But I think it resonates kind of deeper than that. John Turgoning wrote this. I think it's deeply important. He's basically saying that as young researchers, we weren't inspired to get into the field. We didn't start our PhDs. We didn't begin our work because we wanted lots of people to cite us. You can get likes on social media already. You're doing this because you care. It's interesting. You're advancing knowledge. You're curious about finding solutions to problems. And maybe you want to make an impact in the world. That's what would inspire me to stay in this career. As we see people leaving research careers around the world, maybe we need to rethink how we're rewarding and valuing the work we do as scientists. But in my work at IDRC, I think this is actually even more problematic. I had the opportunity to meet with the past president of the National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka. And he wrote this piece in The Island, which is the largest newspaper in Sri Lanka. Basically weighing the pros and cons of Sri Lanka universities entering the world rankings. And pointing out like the systematic problems in this system for the global north, global south divide. Largely, it's based on bibliometric. And publishing in journals is really a domain of the global north. There's language barriers. Why in Sri Lanka would I write in English for a journal that's published in Europe if I'm trying to solve a problem in Sri Lanka? A lot of journals are heavily biased towards data sets that are from North America or Western Europe. They won't publish on a data set that's from Sri Lanka. So there's really deep-seated systematic issues with how we value what's good in science. And I, with colleagues, put together this book which kind of unpacked that issue and how there is this challenge with assessing research from the global south in this book. And we offer some solutions from the global south on how we could do that better. One of them that we talk about is research quality plus. So I'm going to get now into what this framework is. Really at the core of it, there are three tenets that I'm going to argue could inspire better research evaluation. The first is that context matters. We had a great conversation about that this morning. Research does not occur in a vacuum. It's always constrained or enabled by the context in which it's occurring. It could be political context in a country. It could be work context at the institution and how collaborative colleagues are on this topic. Always keep context in mind when making assessments of research. It's very ironic in research, we tend to believe we can isolate the quality of our work. We blind reviews, we double blind reviews to try to understand whether it's good science or not. We might learn something from understanding the space in which it's happening. Second is that quality cannot be reduced to a single measure. Those aims to rate someone on their impact factor are going to be flawed. It's not to say that impact factor has no value, but quality is always multidimensional. There are different values we bring to the work we do. Different institutions have different values, different researchers have different values, and those values need to be brought to the surface to really understand was this work contributing to the intent it was. And the third, which I'd love to chat about with you, is that research evaluations should be systematic, which they're not generally. When I'm sent papers to review, 9 times out of 10, I'm given an open box to give my opinion on whether or not this is a good paper. The other reviewer might have totally different responses, and we're not responding on the same issues. So it's very difficult to synthesize that open data. And they're definitely not empirical. And I think this is like a great paradox of our work as scientists, that when we judge our own work, when we peer review, we use our opinion. It's basically how we get funded, it's how we get published, it's how we get into conferences, etc. Whether or not our peers think this is good. No scientific experiment itself would ever be considered credible if it was just opinion-based. So when it comes to making assessments of our own work, we have some pretty flawed methods that we're using. And those three tenets then break out into what we call an RQ plus framework. So in this framework, we actually name contextual factors that are of value to the organization where I built this framework. So we name external factors around the data environment, the maturity of the research field. It's a very important issue if you think about how many frameworks exist in this field, how many researchers are contributing, how big are the data sets, how big are the samples that we're using, to the political environment. And then internal factors too, like the organization itself, and the research capacity strengthening within the project. We then name a series of quality dimensions around the second tenet I was speaking about. So these are specific to IDRC. I will argue with you that they are transferable, but I think there needs to be an iteration of quality dimensions based on who the user of the framework is. What does quality mean to this institution? For us, we named 4 main dimensions. So the traditional view, which usually does get mentioned, is rigor. But then 3 others. And I think these make important contributions to broadening our understanding of research quality. And I want to know if they resonate with you. The second is legitimacy. So it actually lays out kind of fidelity to the context you're working in. So are you actually taking mind to negative consequences of the research you're doing? That's a quality measure for us. Gender, how is it being addressed? Intersectionality, engagement with local knowledge. Are we putting our knowledge onto other communities as we study them? Or are we actually learning from them in the process and empowering their knowledge to count? Importance, which is really the balance of the originality of the idea. Is this research novel, which is seen often as important when we're applying for funding, but also relevance. Is it useful to the community that it's meant to serve, to the challenge we're trying to solve? And then finally, which I think is the dimension that probably is the most innovative in a sense, is positioning for use. And so is this research actually going to be useful in the real world? Then finally, to put the third tenet into the framework, we lay out a series of rubrics so we can have quantitative scoring as well as qualitative judgments made around each of those dimensions and contextual factors. And so just to show you, or actually first important kind of caveat here is I think this is super important, that what that allows us to do, if an implementation scientists in the room, you're familiar with these kind of pathways of change or mid-range models, it allows us to focus on where we actually, as a funding agency or as researchers or as a university, have control in the total trajectory of how research affects the world. And so we can actually observe those dimensions and contextual factors and make changes based on them. And now I'm going to give you an example of how we actually do that. So I think RQ+, and we're doing this, can be used across the research life cycle. At IDRC, we're now using it to position ourselves with other funders. Talk about this is what research means to us. This is how we advocate for it. These are the issues that we might want to work with you on. This is what we mean by good quality research when we talk about that. You can use it for design. So we're now building it into projects at the outset. So you start thinking through those quality dimensions or strategies for navigating context at the beginning of a research project. You can do it to manage research through implementation. You can do it to evaluate, which is why we originally built this framework, so that judge quality. And then finally, to communicate, to tell stories. So here's different factors and how we actually are building that into it. And I'm going to give one example of how we used it, which is a large-scale study. We looked at 170 projects that we had funded at IDRC. So these ranged from about 100,000 Canadian dollars to I think the largest was 11 million. So quite a range of different projects. And just a few points. I'm not going to get into all the methods of the study, but a few important points. So these RQ+ evaluations were made by independent experts. So we got people from outside of IDRC to come in and use the framework to make the judgments. And as much as I said peer review is flawed, it doesn't mean we throw out the baby with the bathwater. They were experts in the fields of research that were being assessed. But importantly to the third tenet, they were also empirical assessments. So they didn't just read published papers from the projects. They read published papers, they talked to the authors, they talked to the intended beneficiaries to actually make a fulsome assessment of what the research meant. And so this is purposefully a bit blurry, but because I didn't want you to focus even on the data or the numbers, not that data or numbers probably scare anyone in this room, but that's not the point. The point is this is the kind of result we could get from using the framework. And so these are projects, and these are our contextual factors and quality dimensions. And so the first thing, it allowed us to see projects that were doing particularly well, to find cases of exception that we could learn from, identify what it was. But just as importantly, it also let us explore contextual factors at a meta level for our organization. So we could see on average, in aggregate, how we were doing and what kind of context we were working in, what kind of strategies we would need to develop to work in those contexts. And equally, we could look at quality dimensions. Where did we have strengths at a whole level? And where did we have weaknesses that we needed to improve upon? Interestingly, through the use of this framework, when we first built it, we were having a change in government. And our Canadian government instituted the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And IDRC has a proud tradition of being a kind of gender-aware institution. So we were saying, this is exactly what we do. But when we used the framework, we found that, according to the independent experts, our weakest dimension of quality by a long shot was how we were dealing with gender research. And it was really kind of a kick for us to get better and be able to actually make a change in that space. So I love to think of that as like evidence-based improvement in how we're doing it. And so what's important here too, to give you this view, is that this is just the quantitative results. And so alongside of each of these assessments, and this is just for our global health program, the set two from there, were qualitative judgments of why the reviewers were reaching these conclusions. And that was incredibly important. And we've done multiple qualitative syntheses to understand the how and the why. How could we get better at building gender? What were some strategies to do that? Why were we not building it in well at current? Less easy to show that on a slide. But then we could go a bit further too. We could introduce some what I'll call demographic variables, like what type of institution was doing those research in this project, how big was the grant, was it in this region or that? And as the economists say, we could crank the data to learn. And so here I'm just going to give some very high level kind of findings that we found relationships through quantitative meta-analysis in our research that kind of busted some myths for us. The first was that there was always this assumption that when there needed to be a lot of capacity strengthening in a project, that the scientific rigor was not going to be as good in that work. We actually found the opposite. So capacity strengthening led to higher levels of rigor in research projects. And for us, that was like kind of a breakthrough. We could work with institutions that required that type of support and not expect that it was going to be lower quality science as a result. And that's kind of an important finding, I think, when we think about global research. Another important result for us is that we saw that there's this old adage in science, I think it's Max Planck who said it, that how does a new scientific fact become a truth? Well, the current faculty in the university pass on, pass away, and the new researchers actually get to share their opinions. And we did find this to be true in our work, that younger researchers, younger career researchers, were actually doing this projects that scored the highest on innovation in their fields. It's an interesting finding. But we actually found one factor was more closely correlated to innovation and the originality of the work. And that was whether or not the project, how close the researchers were to the problem being researched. So the most innovative solutions were actually coming from people who were most close to the problem. I thought that was incredibly powerful to think about the power of problem solving that people who face issues have, and to allow that knowledge to come through and be valued also. And finally, a very important finding for us is that there has traditionally been this view that research occurring in the global north is just higher quality than research happening in the global south. And according to our independent expert reviewers, the quality across all dimensions, so rigor, legitimacy, usefulness, and importance was higher when it was happening in the global south. And there's an important nuance here. I'm not suggesting that the astrophysics at KwaZulu-Natal is better than the astrophysics at University of Toronto. What we fund is research for development, so research that's intended to contribute to a problem. And we learned that Southern researchers were generating, on average, higher quality work in that space than was when people were being helicoptered in to do that work for them, in a sense. So we published this in the paper in research evaluation, and it got quite a bit of attention because I think it busted a lot of myths about the global research enterprise for many people. And I think, too, it was kind of demonstrating a different way of doing research assessment that was now being validated in a sense. It was viable to do it this way, and you could think about research quality differently. And it had attention, and I think this was exciting, very exciting for us. It was put on the front page of Nature, and alongside a update to the theory of relativity, and issue was our work on research quality, and that was very exciting for our organization. But I think what's actually most exciting here is the change that signaled. So Nature itself, which is the journal that rests on the laurels of having the best bibliometrics year on and year in and year out, the most citations, the highest impact factor, itself was saying that peer review and citations tell us little or nothing about how to improve science and its stewardship, and that the dominant types of research evaluation that Nature benefits from take a narrow view of what constitutes quality, often undervaluing unique solutions to unique problems. So I was more motivated to the change that this was signaling and give Nature a lot of credit for kind of opening up to these alternative views. So I'm going to conclude with just a bit about what we want to do next. And so we are contributing this framework to the kind of global movement that's occurring. We're not the only ones talking about reshaping the way that we assess research quality that's happening across global health globally. We're contributing it, and I think it's really the only practical validated model for doing this. And it's shared by DORA, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment as such. We're also using it to actually influence. And so here's a slide I used when I was at the UN's Agriculture Research Centers, the CGIAR, in Rome. I was coming from Canada in February. This is Ottawa. Thought it found it funny. But we're using it to advocate like major bodies on how they can start shifting the way they're valuing and evaluating science. And I think that's pretty exciting to contribute to kind of change in this domain, and increasingly being called upon to kind of help institutions pick it up and put it into practice. And importantly, I made a point earlier about iteration being essential. So I would argue that you should use that version of RQ+ I showed you with those dimensions because they're necessary to judge quality. But I think it's important that you actually shape your own here in this institution, that what is actually values that we hold for what counts as good research. So we've gone through a process of actually doing that iteration and developing a tailored version of RQ+ for a specific subdomain of research. And this is an area I have a great deal of intellectual interest in, and I've been doing work in I call research co-production. It goes by many names, but it's effectively producing research with the users of knowledge, the beneficiaries of knowledge, and the holders of knowledge, so that everybody's brought together to decide which questions should be asked, how we're going to answer those questions in a way that makes sense to everybody, and then potentially even implement what we found from that collaboratively, rather than thinking that as researchers we can solve problems for people. So traditionally, that domain of research, a lot of work I've done has kind of pointed out how it's undermined by mainstream methods of evaluation, and it's kind of tripped up in the process. And Jim has done a lot of work on this too. So we developed a test to iterate RQ+ for this domain, and we field tested it and published the results where we iterated the framework, came up with new dimensions that I'm not going to get into the details of now, but effectively a versioned framework for evaluating research co-production, which I think is very exciting, and we're sharing it in open access if you're interested in guiding from the beginning to the end, if you think about the different uses, a research co-production project that you might be leading or working on. We've put it into action now in IDRC's major investment in sexual reproductive health rights research. We're still allowed to say that in Canada for the time being. We don't have to call it some other name yet. So it's built in from the startup projects to actually build how co-production will happen on these topics. And another exciting thing is that we've just applied to bring that framework that we've learned to develop in the Global South to the United States, where it's being used as the main framework in a PCORI-funded grant for advancing the science of engagement, where HIV service organizations across the US South will be using it to engage in research relationships with researchers who come to work in their clinics or their organization. There's a lot of issues in the US South with researchers taking some extractive stances on accessing people and taking their data without their involvement and what that knowledge is actually going to be used to do, what problems they actually want the knowledge to contribute to as well. And so RT Plus for CoPro is going to be the framework that's rolled out in that project. So I will wrap it up there. I just want to bring it back to being here in Atlanta is a great privilege for me, and say thank you. And I hope that in some ways this work could contribute to what you're doing here and could be of interest to you. And you might want to learn more about it. I'd be happy to talk. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Any questions for Rob? Davey?
I just had a question more about like the implementers of the framework. So
Guys, want to just introduce yourselves too when you're with questions? So, yeah.
I'm Devi Prasad. I'm a second-year PhD student here in the Global Health Development Program. It was really interesting, but I was wondering if like, let's say like USAID is using it to evaluate portfolio research that they're doing, would they like, in terms of who's actually doing, like using the framework, does it have to be researchers or PhDs or academics, or like kind of what level of understanding people need to have?
It's a great question. Yeah. In fact, we found that when we did our first applications, we were bringing in like experts with storied academic careers because we thought that peer knowledge was incredibly important, and it is. But we actually learned that looking at research across those dimensions, it takes you away from focusing on methods. And that's an important part. Like you want to know, was this powered correctly? Was the framework used for analysis the right one based on where the literature is at in this domain right now? Very important. But it actually opened it up to a whole different range of specializations that people who weren't those hardcore researchers were actually contributing a lot of knowledge to. So I think it requires a degree of expertise in the field of study, but there's also a lot that can be brought to it because we've now used teams to do it from people who don't have that traditional training. And they might have a much better understanding about the utility of the work. Like, is this actually policy relevant research? What are the main policy questions right now? So we're trying to bring different people together to make those evaluations. Yeah, but good point.
Really enjoyed your talk, and I enjoyed our conversation earlier. And I always enjoy hearing someone endorse and own coming from a feminist organization and being self-critical when they recognize that things aren't going well. And I just wondered if you could unpack a little bit for us, what was it about gender equality that wasn't working, and what solutions did your organization identify to address that?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. I probably can't speak completely comprehensively about the response, but I was a part of this movement, so I should own some of it. But effectively, I think a high level assessment was that like gender was kind of being dealt with in like you'd disaggregate a data set and then you'd run the analysis with women and men as two different points, which is great because there may be very different results for different sexes in different domains of research. But were you actually building methodologies that would approach the question with an understanding of the different ways that women and men might engage in that study as participants? Not happening very much. So it was kind of this like surface level approach to gender in research that was occurring. And so what we did to try to improve on this was use ArchiPlus to identify some winners, some projects that were doing this really well, bring them in, showcase them as kind of exemplars of how you could build gender across the research cycle in a meaningful way. And it's different in different projects, of course, but some exemplars of how it can be done and learn from those. And we developed programs that would kind of showcase that stuff and share it with grantees who get grants, but also with IDRC staff ourselves to understand what to look for when we're project officers on any of these projects. So I think ArchiPlus played a great deal in like identifying solutions that were actually also like not just us coming back and saying, okay, get better on it in these ways. It was like, these are real solutions that have been proven in the field because they come from projects. We could build those strategies into projects we were funding going forward. And interesting, as we've done this over time, so kind of longitudinally, we've gotten much better on gender equality with different external experts across the field. So it's been effective. But still lots to learn, for sure. Yeah.
I'm Kamini Draglu. I'm a second year global health PhD student. And I guess my question is, in the context, specifically in the US, where there's a lot of kind of mistrust and distrust about research, how do you see your framework kind of improving the science, like the field to address those issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't think it's going to solve the problem. So don't take my answer like that. What I think it does is help reinvent what science like means. Like traditionally research assessments, it's just about rigor. It's just about methods, frameworks, and whether or not you're implementing them properly. But if you actually build in like, is this useful research? Then people buy into research who aren't scientists. They want to know, like, you know, is it legitimate? Does it actually embed local knowledge in the solution, or is it just some external view on what? So I think that it can contribute to a process of like making research more meaningful to people who aren't researchers. And I think that vision of research, if that's what we consider to be high quality research, it should help push back on why we would distrust the experts who just sit in their ivory towers and apply their methods and come up with these solutions, which science, there's more wrong than there is right? So I can understand why this pushback against expertise in some space.
Katie?
I have one more question. You talked in the beginning about like the different biases involved in peer review, and I was wondering, I know you're like, you said that the framework is being operated now using a team, but how do you incorporate like positionality and the reviewer's own?
Yeah, great question. Yeah. I mean, to the best of our ability, it's such a great question. And it's something we're struggling with. Like the evaluator themselves is riddled with biases. The work was riddled with biases. And pulling that all apart is always going to be a struggle. But so when we hire the teams to do the evaluations, we do try to think about regional expertise. We do try to think about gender expertise, but also gender representation and other domains that would be important to the specific field of work. But yeah, it's quite a struggle. And if it's work you're doing now, I'd love to know more about it. Yes. Yeah.
Rob, I have like 1,000 questions, as you might expect, but let me just kind of throw out 3 things, and then you can just see if you have time for whichever ones. The first thing is I was kind of interested in the number 1 part of the framework about the contextual factors.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe just a bit of context. I mean, some of the work that we've been doing with Carter Center over the last few years, we've got a lot better understanding about the role of sort of human reasoning as part of the implementation of programs, and how the way that people experience those programs, the way they reason about them and what they're supposed to do, how it can actually affect the performance of the program. And so I was just I was struck that there was no explicit sort of social context in that first part. So that's the first one. The second one's simple. It's about a kind of temporal effect of research. So seeing, the example, you think about messenger RNA vaccines, and, someone 50 years ago was messing around with whether they could stabilize messenger RNA. Had absolutely nothing to do, probably really impossible to imagine the various ways that it could have value down the road, but turned out to be enormously valuable in certain ways, but it was just treated as kind of investigator-driven, interesting stuff. So be interested to see how that part gets reflected. And then the final thing, in some ways, and we've talked briefly about this morning, but it's the sort of responsive mechanisms at the funding level. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about what kind of mechanisms and processes on the funding side you guys are experimenting with or playing around with about, and where you see that kind of delivering the most value. Because I think that's in some ways the most mysterious part of it all. And it sounds like you guys are so much more progressive in the way that you're thinking about those things. So those are some of the things that are on my mind about it.
Yeah. Let me see if I can.
Oh yeah, like, do you want me to add more? So
You can pick one so we can also ask other questions.
yeah.
Let me go to the second one first and say I completely agree with you, and I think so that framework is a representation of the values for IDRC. We don't fund a lot of basic curiosity-driven lab science sometimes, but not a lot of it. However, I think something like this could still apply because the argument is you iterate the dimensions to the context and the mission of that research. What are you trying to achieve? What would be valuable? Thinking that through. And then actually measuring those things, not just how many times the paper gets read.
Even the value of the imagination, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, that there would be a space for utility in that type of evaluation because it might not be that the user is a policymaker or a vaccine developer quite yet, but other scientists. So are you actually contributing, your user is the rest of your field who are trying to push ideas forward at that basic science level. They're research users too. And are you contributing to the latest problems in that research field, new knowledge that pushes the debate? I'm just gonna riff on your first one for a second about the social processes. I agree with you. It's interesting too, like the interpretation component. I've been thinking a lot about that in research, not just in research use. Like whenever you talk about reproducibility or replicability of research, it's always just about methods and data. It's not like, imagine doing a reproduction study on the discussion section of a paper. You know what I mean? Would different researchers produce the same discussion across papers? And like, no, I'm willing to bet that would rarely happen. I mean, maybe similar conclusions would be reached, but anyway. So interpretation, I think, is such an interesting place in the research world right now, and how we deal with it is a really important thought. And then, of course, that plays into how findings are interpreted.
Piggyback when you're ready, but
Yeah,
piggyback
go ahead.
on,
Yes,
one of the
absolutely.
questions really struck me and I wanted to. Whenever you're ready.
Right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's just such a great discussion, and I really appreciated Jim's comment about how progressive your organization is, and yet identifying real structural challenges in terms of questions of equity and equality on social dimensions. And I just wanted to share what a fellow of ours in a leadership development program specifically focused on underrepresented people in science, did a study of Fogarty.
Okay.
And found, looked at trajectories of PIs of training grants, not surprisingly, finding predominantly white men in high-income countries being the PIs. And even after the introduction in 2006 of an MPI opportunity, yes, seeing some movement of representation in that space, but still gross inequities. In addition, just to get at sort of the nuances of the social relationships that Jim is describing, the funding levels, so the proportion of grants that went over the ceiling were much higher among grants with men as PIs.
Wow.
Because men negotiate with the project officers and they understand the system behind the system, if that makes sense. And so I'm just, on the one hand, applauding your recognition and acknowledgement of these very deep-seated structural barriers, and also the challenges of overcoming those things, given how progressive your organization is. And so, and I would say probably much more progressive than certain institutes within the NIH. And so thinking about ways of, your point Jim, is so well taken, thinking about ways of systematically communicating with funders why this is important. The context of funding and how that really can perpetuate, mitigate, or reverse some of these structural disadvantages. So maybe I have thoughts about that.
Totally different question.
Okay.
Most of us in this room,
The
all of
prerogative
us,
of the chair.
no, all of us in this room have been in the begging bowls. We're looking for funding. That's the university environment, it's soft money. And I'm very familiar with IDRC and second what's been said. How does one engage the variation in the mission of whether it's a national institute or taxpayer money, as we're told in the US? You are, NIH is taxpayer money. How is this relevant to the US is a constant question that in working in global health that we're having to navigate. It has to, and that's not a completely invalid argument, right? So you have that bucket there. So there's two, the foundations of the world. We're going to make life better for everybody, and that's kind of. So how does one? There's so much of variation, and I really applaud for IDRC being in the edge and trying to make it then.
Yeah.
How does one navigate that side of it? And I don't think it's just, talking to the project. I mean, I agree with what Catherine said, but it's so much more complex. And what are your thoughts on that? And is it, for want of a better word, circuitous? In other words, how peer review happens and how, the whole thing, the whole cycle, why do you, they're breaking the cycle. A person will not survive if they don't get the applications. That's, the metrics that are used in tenure decisions or et cetera, et cetera. So just wanted to get your thoughts from the framework of being in the part where decision-making about who to give money and where to give the money.
I think what's important for RQ Plus in a way is it's also a transparency exercise.
Yeah.
So like we're saying, intersectionality matters in our research. So if you're applying for funding, address it in your approach. If you don't agree, then I guess it's transparency is important. I do agree that variation, and that's why I'm going to argue that there needs to be Fogarty needs a different version of G+, but they need to lay out qualities. That's my argument. What are the values they're looking for in research so their community can respond? What are taxpayers' values?
Right.
Let's be explicit about that, so we can match our research to the needs of those investors. I hope I'm answering at least some of that, because it's a big question. And Catherine, to go to your point, I completely agree. And I think it's not just what we've actually proven with RQ Plus when I was sharing those mythbusters, I call them. It's not just inequity. So it's not just a fairness issue. It's a efficiency issue. The research in the global south that's intended to solve research in Argentina that's intended to solve an Argentinian policy problem, we've proven is better quality research for that problem than research from the United States. So it's actually, we're not getting the results when those inequities are built into the research system. And so,
Rob, Catherine's point, I did a talk a few years ago at an IC, the Institute Center Extramural Research Forum at NIH, talking about our stakeholder engagement, organizational learning stuff. One of my slides is your Nature paper, right? And I talked about that and talked about these challenges of budgets and protocols locking you down. You don't have responsive mechanisms, and talking about that sort of stuff. And these are, directors, senior program people, they get it. Their problem is that the decision-making apparatus in an organization like NIH has got a $50 billion budget. Their board is Congress.
I think that's what Usha was getting at.
Yeah, and that's exactly so.
These are multiple
They're the
systems.
stakeholders.
Yeah.
The real
They are the
stakeholders.
real stakeholders.
Reinforcing system of systems.
And what we're not good at is solving for those stakeholders, right? Because you've got to solve for them, and of course your framework, the political, it's mind-bogglingly political. Because it's about, you know, whether some representative's jurisdiction or district has got some, you know, like it all comes down to that sort of stuff. But I think it's the demonstrating that there are ways of thinking about this. I think that just keeping at it, and I think your point about keeping those relationships that we already have to some degree and keeping them alive and those conversations going, you know. And there's a call out for a new director, the bidder at the training, you know, at Fogarty, so maybe get a plant in there somewhere.
Actually, I'm gonna have to go to another meeting, but I did want to introduce myself and see if you have any extra time this afternoon. I'm Christine Moe. I'm the director of the Center for Global Safe Wash.
Okay.
And we have a new consortium that involves 7 countries, 6 sub-Saharan African countries and Bangladesh, build capacity in applied research in water sanitation and hygiene. And it's all supposed to be stakeholder driven, which sounds great in theory, but is so hard to put into practice. And I'm just wondering if you have videos or if we can get you to give a webinar or something to this relatively new consortium, because it seems like this RQ Plus can be used proactively to shape research, not just retroactively.
Yes,
Yeah.
and especially in stakeholder-driven or co-production research,
Exactly.
bring forward those different components of doing it that way that matter so much, forming the relationship, building trust. In traditional research evaluations, your paper getting published has nothing to do with the trust you build with the
Right,
community
right.
and how much voice you really have in that work. So bringing forward that in your research approach is so important and something, yeah, I'd love to talk more about it.
Is he booked up for the rest of the day?
You can take my slot at 4. Do you want to do that?
I have another meeting. at
Okay,
12.
anyone else could switch out?
Who's running his schedule?
I'm also happy to follow up.
I'm his shepherd. We can, you want to switch with Usha? Okay, and then Usha, you can switch with me? Okay,
Okay.
3 o'clock, that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful, just perfect. I'm your agent, I've just booked you a new meeting.
All right, or you can come to me,
Yeah,
or should I come to you?
Can you come here?
6:16,
6:16.
right at the end of the hall, opposite end of the hall from Usha's office on 6th floor.
16 at 3 o'clock.
Okay, thanks, Christine.
The one we saved for Roger Glass, who's the ex-director.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions? We're kind of at a time.
The sensitive ones.
Catherine, please.
So we have your comment about, you know, the young, I don't want to use the term young because I don't like that term, but some of our earliest career scholars create some of the greatest innovation in context. We've also, and this is sensitive, and I'm just going to put it out there, and I'm open to criticism or attacks, whatever people feel is necessary. But we've observed some real challenges in context, creating space for our trainees to be able to succeed and to have that protected space. And so part of what we're trying to build in this training grant is a culture in which you're flipping a lot of hierarchies. You're flipping age hierarchies, you're flipping supervisory hierarchies, you're flipping intersectional hierarchies. And so I tend not to treat sort of the global South, I tend not to use that word because I don't think it's monolithic. And I think that there are challenges and inequities locally that can elevate voices that may serve to reinforce hierarchies that you're describing. I just wonder, have you all thought about that, and can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it's led us to be much more open to is the role of like capacity strengthening projects, where it used to be like how many trainees on this project.
Exactly.
It's now about what is the role and how are they contributing, and doing a much deeper assessment of like, because everyone needs capacity strengthening, whether you're new to a field or it's cross-disciplinary work and you're learning a new method or a new means of interpretation, whatever it might be. What are the actual roles, and getting a deeper view of the trainees on projects to to like grow that potential and to encourage it in grants. So that's actually been occurring. Yeah, but I mean, I agree, there's a lot of work to do in that space and making the most of like new minds and on addressing issues, because there's great potential in outside the box thinking, whether you're young or just new to the field.
Yeah, so I think there's applicability to the research framework that you have for the training framework as well, capacity strengthening framework that I was chatting.
Yeah.
They should be separated.
Exactly.
That's not the
Yes,
problem.
I mean, I think it can be integrated.
They have to go together.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Rob, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Congratulations on all the work. And it's just, thanks for sharing it with us. Really thought provoking.
Thank you.